Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you may be in the world. My name is Sophia Arend, and I'm the Global Blockchain Business Council's Communications and Content Lead. It's my pleasure to welcome you today to the Global Blockchain Business Council and Global Digital Finance's Global Leaders Series. This is a weekly global town hall we host with policymakers and business leaders to hear insights into their work, the state of the blockchain and digital asset industry, and current global affairs. Today, we have the pleasure to be joined by Congressman Warren Davidson, representing Ohio's 8th Congressional District, and GBBC CEO and GDF Board Director Sandra Ro for a conversation and live audience Q&A on the Congressman's efforts advocating blockchain and cryptocurrency adoption, his vision for the United States, as well as his role on the Task Force for Financial Technology, and his views on key issues surrounding emerging technologies such as data privacy and financial inclusion. Before we begin, I'd like to briefly introduce our guest, Congressman Davidson. He represents Ohio's 8th Congressional District. He is a member of the House Financial Services Committee, where he is focused on policies that help grow our economy, instill fiscal discipline, advance innovation, and limit runaway government expansion that threatens to bankrupt America. After high school, Congressman Davidson enlisted in the Army as an infantryman. As part of the 3rd Infantry Division, he was stationed in Germany and witnessed the fall of the Berlin Wall. Warren's commanding officers recognized his potential and helped him earn an appointment to the United States Military Academy at West Point. He graduated near the top of his class as a student of American history and mechanical engineering. As an officer, he led the Old Guard, the 75th Ranger Regiment, and the 101st Airborne Division. After the Army, Congressman Davidson returned home, worked with his father, and earned an MBA from the University of Notre Dame. There, he spent 15 years owning and operating manufacturing companies in Ohio. In 2016, he responded to the call of service again and came to work in the U.S. House of Representatives. Thank you so much, Congressman, for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you here with us today. And to everyone joining us live, we welcome your questions at any point during today's conversation. You can enter them in the Q&A tab at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Thank you, and I'll hand things over to Sandra.
Fantastic. Thank you, Sophia, and welcome to everyone. Wanted to say this is a very special session. We get to spend some time with Congressman Warren Davidson. He's been a long time advocate on the crypto side. Many of us know this. However, many of us may not know he's also a long-time advocate of data privacy, which we're going to talk about in detail. But to kick off, welcome, Congressman Davidson, and please, for the folks out in the world who may not be as familiar with your rides to coming and doing public service, obviously you started in the military and have had a long-standing career in public service. Tell us a little bit about how you became a House representative.
Yeah, thanks for the question, and definitely an honor to join you all. And just thanks for the interest. So, how did I become a member of Congress? I mean, America is just this amazing place. I mean, you highlighted in my bio, I just enlisted in the Army. I didn't go straight to college. I was a, soldier in the Army. And if my personal story ended at, you got to go to West Point and become an Army officer, you'd say, God bless America. What an amazing place. I think things like that are part of why so many people from all over the world come to America. Things like that are possible that aren't in other places. Maybe you weren't from the right background, right connections, or whatever else. Once you're out of high school, you're already down a path that's kind of hard to deviate from. So I got out of the Army after that, had a good career in the Army, and then got out and got into business, got into manufacturing, started my own company after a couple of years, and went and got an MBA, and just started doing acquisitions, building companies. And again, you'd say, God bless America. What a great place. This is awesome. And so in 2015, John Boehner resigned as our member of Congress. He was obviously the Speaker of the House, is how most people would know him, but he was the member of Congress that represented my district. And so pretty immediately, all your traditional sort of candidates got in the race, and a couple of people stopped by my office about 2 months later, raising money for something else. And they said, well, hey, who are you going to support in the congressional race? And I said, well, you guys are the political people. Who's everybody going to get behind? And they just kind of jokingly said, well, it'd be great if there was an Army Ranger business guy in the race. And so we laughed. And then I went home and told my wife about my day, and I thought she would laugh. And she said, well, what'd you tell him? I said, we laughed because it was crazy. And she said, it's not crazy. You'd be great at that. So it's kind of an indirect path. We got in like 10 minutes before the filing deadline.
Wow.
So not normally like the ideal way to do it. But we did it like we were launching a product. the person that did marketing for my business, ran the campaign. And we had like a 90-day sprint and won by about 8 points.
Amazing.
Pretty crazy.
Well, to be frank, you kind of got chosen by the folks who wanted to support you. So that's actually even better than deciding you want to run yourself. So that's great. Well, we're glad to have you. And, you know, when we think about how we know you, it's almost one-dimensional because a lot of us are coming from the blockchain and crypto space. It would be great if you could just give us a little bit of backstory about how you even found out about crypto and blockchain for those who may not be as familiar.
Yeah, so during my business career, I was in manufacturing, and inherently, manufacturing's been, global, especially over the past 20, 25 years.
Sure.
And so, global business requires a global financial system. And so when you move money across borders, sometimes it can be pretty tedious. And not only are there sometimes high transaction costs, the bigger cost is the friction and the time, massive time lags in some cases. We would wire money and then the vendor would say they can't ship product. And we're like, what do you mean? We already wired the money. Your bank has the money. They say, well, we don't have the money. And you could show that their bank had received the money, but you don't know for sure, did the bank move the money to their account? Or are they coming up with excuses or whatever? So you wanted to have a more direct way to move money. And so that led to kind of early on looking at things like DigiCash or eGold or, other forms of digital money. And then in the US in 0809, we had, a big, planetary, we had the global financial crisis, but in 0809 in the US, manufacturing sector was really hit hard. So I was kind of in survival mode through those years. And then right out of it, we were just trying to grow like crazy, take advantage of the market, which was working. So I missed the very early launch of Bitcoin, but then started paying attention to it, probably early 2013.
Awesome. And obviously you saw some actual frictions and problems that potentially blockchain and crypto could solve because you run your own business and you've seen the problems. But then that's fantastic because not every legislator has that dimension as well of understanding what there are actually business problems to be solved by potentially implementing the blockchain and crypto. When you when you are talking to other legislators, where would you put the level of knowledge right now versus, 5 years ago is probably much lower, but where would you put it right now in terms of the level of understanding?
Well, just as a proxy for the space, when I came to Congress in 2016, Bitcoin was trading for under $1,000. Obviously peaked above 60 so far. And I would say there are people that could follow all that movement and understand it. But I'd say Congress's level of knowledge is still at the $1,000 level. It's pretty low comparatively. There are people who are opposed to it because they just don't understand it. And I'd say that's the bulk of the people. If they're paying attention to it at all, their insecurity, if they're opposed to anything in the space, has been superficial. There are a handful of people who really understand it and have landed on the wrong side of the issue. But I think for the most part, once people actually understand what's going on here and the opportunity that it presents, broadly for, people at all levels, for the unbanked, underbanked, the reality is the history of the financial system, not just in America, but around the world, governments have often used the monetary system as a means of control, not just as a way to have a store of value and a means of exchange.
Right.
And these brief periods where you get focused on the right level of activity, its function as a store of value and a means of exchange, are great, because unfortunately you've had a long history around the world of people saying, well, you're not going to bank those people, are you? And of course, those people change over time. And, I think you break across party lines once people actually understand what's going on here. And my hope is that this financial technology space is truly bipartisan. I think it clearly has the potential to be.
Yeah, it should be, considering we're talking about an innovation that doesn't really adhere to either party, but appreciate you saying that. When you think about the practical applications of blockchain and crypto for the US, what areas do you think, what's your vision for if the US really does take a hold of this and is a leader across innovation? What are the areas that really kind of excite you the most? Is it really the payment side, or is it beyond that?
Oh, it's so much more than that. And I spend a lot of time talking about that because people think of blockchain and they inherently go to the biggest asset is Bitcoin currently. But that's like, early on AOL was not the internet. AOL was widely adopted. I think Bitcoin will probably be a good bit more enduring than AOL, but time will tell. But the internet was always going to be bigger than any one entity. And we haven't even begun to tap all the use cases for the internet. In my view, the architecture blockchain, offers to be truly transformative in a way, maybe only most closely comparable to the internet. The number of use cases is nearly infinite, and the approach is great because in my view, it's just a more secure architecture even for the internet. So I look for like a blockchain enabled internet in the future. And, it just establishes trust in a different way. And the number of use cases that I've seen just even in terms of, moving custody or ownership, establishing or protecting identity. I mean, ways to move real estate, title to property. I mean, there are a ton of use cases that are probably just like in the .com era. Some are a little premature. They're not going to be ripe yet. But I think there's just going to be all this flourishing that can happen because of this great technology.
Well, thank you so much for saying that, because we absolutely agree with you that there are multi-layers to this technology and many, many use cases we haven't even thought of yet. And we can't just be pigeonholed by just thinking about the payments or the crypto side, albeit still very important. There are many, many more chapters to this story. And when we think about it from a US perspective, where do you see the US competitively relative to the rest of the world? I think some would argue the private sector is actually holding its own and leading.
Well, look, in the United States, we have a massive competitive advantage. I mean, one, look, there's some great countries around the world, and with due respect, I mean, I'm an American, so I'm going to be pretty pro-American here. I'm very proud of the fact that, we have less than 5% of the population, but we have about 25% of the world's GDP. We have over 50% of the world's invested securities. Our capital markets are great. Our markets for goods and services are great. Our market for intellectual property is great. So when people have an idea, a lot of times they want to launch it here, not just because of the size of the market, but because of our intellectual property laws and property rights. And I think when you take that as a jumping off point, protecting property rights is really important. And you talk about data. Look at all the billionaires that have been created off of data arbitrage, essentially monetizing a little bit of everyone's data and then putting it together. And in my view, if we can, maybe protect that property right for individuals better, we can lift everyone out of that, and we can collaborate in this economy. America has the potential to do that like no other place. And part of that's even in our founding documents and the Bill of Rights and the civil liberties that are protected. I mean, not every country, individuals might value privacy around the world, but not every country has a system of government that's supposed to guarantee protection of that privacy. So, and then because of some of those advantages, I mean, we have Silicon Valley, we have our capital markets, but here's where we're losing. We haven't done the regulatory certainty that people need. If they're going to put capital at risk, they need to know that the Securities and Exchange Commission isn't going to come in after the fact and deem it all a security and essentially blow up the entire business. That's something that Ripple and the XRP community are dealing with right now, and something that a lot of people fear as they have an idea, even if it originated in America, sometimes they look to launch it outside our country. So I think that's a risk. If we want to see us build on the competitive advantages that we have in the United States, we can do that. And the other thing is, when the United States has had innovation, we've really shared it with the world.
Yep.
It's been very collaborative like that. And in other places, when there's innovation, they haven't done such a good job of sharing. And I think the whole premise behind this type of economy is it's a much more shared system and a much more collaborative system. So I like where you can go with real distributed ledger, true blockchain technology.
Well, certainly, and it's just refreshing to hear someone who sits in Congress recognizing the fact that we still have gaps with respect to the regulatory clarity side. Some would argue it is very clear. Well, I don't know. I wouldn't necessarily agree with that. I think we still have a lot of gray areas that business folks, the entrepreneurs out there, find difficult to navigate. So appreciate that you're working hard to get those pieces bedded down. Do you see 2021 and 2022? Are you more bullish or are you more bearish on the US actually providing that sort of level of clarity that we need? Do you think we're going to step up? And when I say we, I mean the US.
Well, yeah. So thanks for the question. Look, we're building a little bit of momentum in Congress. It isn't really a partisan issue. We had a good hearing today on our task force. But so Darren Soto, a Democrat from Florida, and I introduced the Token Taxonomy Act in 2018.
Right.
So we've been working for, closing in on 3 years now to just try to get a hearing on our bill. My hope is that we can get a hearing on the Token Taxonomy Act by the end of the year. And part of what's going to make that ripe is just things like, the SEC's action on XRP and Ripple. And the SEC itself is kind of undergoing a bit of change just because of the political process in America. We get a new leader for the SEC. Jay Clayton, the former chairman, was, I won't say openly hostile, but he certainly wasn't very supportive of innovation in this space. And, Gary Gensler, the new SEC chairman, has taught MIT classes available for free on MIT's, free education platform. So he at least understands the space, which is promising to say, well, we will have a leader that will help us get better regulatory clarity. I was hoping to see something accelerate in terms of their priority list when I saw some of the things come out recently. But we're going to continue our dialogue, and I feel optimistic that it might not be as top 1, 2, 3, 4 priority, but hopefully we'll get it in the top tier and get action out of the SEC this year.
Fantastic. And you mentioned the task force, and you are a senior ranking member of the Fintech task force. Could you tell us a bit more about your objectives? What would you say drives this task force? Is it?
Yeah, so the Financial Services Committee is an established committee in Congress. We have things like the Capital Markets Subcommittee, financial institutions, housing, things like that you would look at that make up the, financial services infrastructure of the United States. But there wasn't a very good emphasis on Fintech because, as we've talked about, or alluded to here with blockchain, just this one use case transcends, whether it's banking, housing, payment systems, you name it, monetary policy, any number of things, it kind of transcends it. And so when you look at, the era of innovation, I think the goal is to say, look, how do we understand it? How do we educate and inform members? And how do we inform the other subcommittees on good policy as it relates to Fintech? And I will say, look, the goal of Congress at some level needs to be that, America was well positioned to flourish in the industrial age, the agricultural innovation age, the internet age. Obviously, you look at the automobile and aviation, all these kinds of things flourished in America. And, I don't think they did that by accident in anything. You had a lot of private sector innovators, but then you had a regulatory and market that was ready to rise to the challenge. So hopefully we get that right again, and we do it for fintech.
Well, certainly appreciate you and Congressman Soto doing your part. Could you talk a little bit more about some of the legislative work that you've done, including the Token Taxonomy Act, because you've done certainly a huge body of work over the last 3 years, and we're rooting for you. We hope that some of these do become laws. But could you talk a bit about that work as well?
Yeah, I mean, outside of the Token Taxonomy Act, I mean, just to briefly talk on that, it does three main things. It creates a bright line test for what is or is not a security. If it falls on one side of it, then it's a security. So you're just regulated by America's securities laws. And you look at, any one of them, I might have things that I love or hate about, but it doesn't change the securities laws. It just says, if you're on this side of it, just either great news or bad news, but you're a security. If you're on the other side of it, well, then you're not a security, and you don't have to worry about the SEC coming in and becoming your regulator after that.
Right.
The other thing is it deals with custody issues. Technology is largely solving custody issues for the market, but there are still some regulators out there that need to understand a clear definition of custody and how to do the regulatory environment around that. And then last, it deals with tax treatment on it. Beyond that space in financial services, one of the big things is democratic access to capital. So a lot of our current laws kind of protect deal flow for, I'll say it a little pejoratively, the donor class, people that are already wealthy. Accredited investors are already pretty wealthy folks. But a lot of times you have even the people that are writing code for startups that can't risk their own small amount of money. They might only have $10,000 or $25,000 to invest in a startup, but they can't because they're not accredited investors. And you look at the kind of idea behind Robinhood. You saw that one of the debates we were having in Congress is, hey, should we treat stuff on a Reddit thread really differently than what people put on a Bloomberg terminal? And I think no. You should have one set of rules. You shouldn't have a special set of rules for the Wall Street brokerage firms and a different set for the average retail investor. So that kind of touches a little bit on fintech and the space. And then one of the big areas for me has been privacy. So look at my military background. I'm for ending endless wars. I think Congress's job is to declare war. And there is a time for war, and if there is, then there's a time to declare it. There's also a time to end them. So I think this week we're going to officially end, at least in the House, the war in Iraq. Well, it's pretty ended, but not formally, and so we want to end that authorization. One of the things that came out about that era in the United States was the Patriot Act. And that essentially made it so there was a big loophole for the government to spy on American citizens with no warrants or anything else and collect a lot of data. Edward Snowden became famous for breaking the law, leaking a lot of classified information, but making it clear what the government was doing because of ostensibly the Patriot Act. But a lot of that goes back to, like I say, third-party doctrine. Once you've shared it with somebody like your bank, it's deemed to be no longer private. So we've been working hard since I've been in Congress on privacy broadly and financial privacy, within financial services. But I think one of the most overdue pieces of legislation for the United States Congress is a broad privacy bill that protects property rights for the owners of the data.
I couldn't agree with you more. And let's start delving into data and data privacy, because not only are you've been a major advocate, and we're so grateful for that, but the entire notion of our future, current and future world is really around data. It's data everywhere, data everything. And that starts from our identity to financial transactions, to our health records, to everything else. And so appreciate you highlighting that overdue legislation includes more power to people and the rights to their own data. And I think if we can be helpful at all as a community, is we help support you in how blockchain can be utilized so that people can manage their own data better. And also, if they choose to, in a 360-degree economy model, where people can actually decide to sell their own data for monetary benefit. But it's up to the person, not some corporation that aggregates it all.
Yeah, and I think, look, if you structure your data correctly, one of the things that blockchain allows nicely, and it's a common illustration. Some of the people watching will have probably seen it or heard it before, but let's go back to the college days. A lot of people would go to a place where they might need to show an ID. They would commonly produce a driver's license, and all you're really trying to say is I'm 21 or older.
Right.
But you share a lot more information about it. Normally, height, weight, eye color,
Yep.
Your address. Are you an organ donor? All kinds of things that you can find out when you get somebody's driver's license. And really, you just want to reveal that one layer. So getting the kind of granularity to protect and control that. And then at the most basic level, creating permissionless systems that don't put your personally identifiable information at risk just to engage in commerce would be a big advantage as well.
So you are starting to get lots of questions here from the audience. I do want to talk about data privacy a little bit more, and then we're going to ask some of the questions from the audience, if that's all right with you.
Sounds good.
Good. On data privacy. So one of the big topics discussed amongst our circles as well as cybersecurity circles is around, we've got honeypots of data sitting in all kinds of places in the US, everywhere in the world, but let's stick to the US. Consulting firms, law firms, banks, even the government has honeypots of data of our data. It gets hacked. When you think about cybersecurity and data management, do you think we need a better infrastructure for this, in the sense that, do we need the government more involved in how our data is stored and managed, or do you think it's the private sector that really needs to solve for this?
I think the private sector needs to solve it, but look, the government has a role in cybersecurity. I mean, the government doesn't leave you on your own to defend yourself against, foreign adversaries, for example. We have a military that's supposed to focus on that. They don't leave you on your own to deal with organized crime rings, and for the most part, if you have a cyber issue, you can't call your local police. They don't know how to do much of anything on this. The skill set, technology, everything else is very limiting. So I think there's a piece there, but I think the other piece that I'm really concerned about is we're privatizing all the profit, and then we're socializing all the risk, right? So when you look at, just pick on a company, they get, let's say a retail establishment, Target was one of the places that got hacked. I mean, tons of them have, so I don't want to single them out, but they get hacked, and it costs a lot of money. It costs consumers a lot of money. It costs banks that have to replace all the debit cards and credit cards a lot of money. And that risk is socialized. And we don't have a good way to hold anyone accountable for the collateral damage that they have. Sure, you want to collect all this information. You don't really want to be responsible for when it gets compromised. I think that was really important on the credit reporting agencies. They collect all this information. They make a mint just selling the data to others, and they have in a way, outsized influence on your life by what they report, whether it's accurate or inaccurate. Once they had a big breach, though, they said, "Oh, well, we'll give you free reports for the first year, and then after that, if you want to do anything with it, you got to buy a subscription."
Yeah.
That's privatizing profit and socializing risk. I think we need a legal framework that stops doing that.
Yep. Again, I appreciate you highlighting that. Absolutely. There are probably 100 other examples you could give around how we need to shore up issues like that from companies in particular being able to monetize tons of our data. I'm going to actually move to a lot of questions here actually coming in. So I'm going to ask this one from someone who's asked, do you think the US needs to look at regulated tech like it does financial services? Does tech itself need to be regulated?
I mean, it is already, right? I mean, you can't do things that are too encrypted. They want you. I think some of the regulations are dysfunctional, both in financial services and tech and everything else. But broadly, we benefit with some level of regulation, right? I mean, we don't want anarchy. I mean, there are probably some folks listening who would consider themselves anarchists or anarcho-capitalists. But in anarchy, there's always somebody that comes in and starts to impose their will. And in my view, the federal government that we have in the United States was created to really protect one person from another person and groups of people from other groups of people. It's a protective type of government, not an authoritarian government. And so we've drifted in some cases in our regulatory approach to being a little too authoritarian for my taste. So I'd like to claw back that regulatory approach in those cases. And we're negligent in other areas, as I highlighted privacy, but let's say in this space at the end of the year, I mean, we almost saw the Treasury in private wallets. They called them self-hosted wallets, and generally they're not hosted, they're cold storage. So privately held digital wallets, we need to protect those because eventually some authoritarian is going to try to ban them.
Yep, absolutely. You've got another question here related to privacy. So we'll keep on the topic of privacy. Federal privacy law regarding federal privacy laws, can compromises be reached on the preemption of state law and private rights of action?
Yes, that's an interesting question. What's the enforcement mechanism? So we've got a bill right now in draft that's called It's Your Data. And it does, as I've alluded to, make it clear that you have a property right in your own data. And so do companies and the things that they create, So for an example, what I search for on Amazon is my data. That's personally identifiable, my personal records, where to ship to, how I'm paying. Those are things that are mine. But, Amazon obviously collects lots of aggregate data about how many people bought this book or that book, what were they searching when they found it,
right,
all those things. Well, that's kind of their trade secret, their data, right? And it makes it clear there. But one of the pieces relevant to your question on this is, how do you enforce it? Is it a private right of action? This really empowers attorneys who will be very motivated to vigorously find instances where violations have occurred. They create classes and provide big lawsuits. And where that would come in handy is when you see things like Google, where they say, oh, well, you can select, don't track my geolocation. And then after the fact, you find out, well, they didn't stop tracking your geolocation, even when you slid the bar, and then they wanted to weasel out of it and say, no, we just said you could slide the bar. We didn't say we weren't going to track. No. Now, how much harm did that cause to any one person? That's always hard to say, but we know that Google made billions and billions of dollars off of that. And when you have a private right of action, it makes it easy for those kind of lawsuits to go forward. I think the alternative model is that a regulator is empowered to do that. And in theory, the Federal Trade Commission is already supposed to hold companies accountable for doing whatever they put in their terms of service. Right. Now, in the financial services space, we won't let companies put whatever they want in the world in the terms of service, right? You can't put ridiculous things on interest rates, for example, in your terms of service. It's regulated. But when it comes to tech, they can pretty much put whatever they want in their terms of service. And even when they put things in it, the FTC lacks the technical expertise and competence and scope to even hold them accountable. So I think lastly, a lot of it, the protection is for consumers. So some people want to put the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau in charge of this. In a way, that's the most blank check thing because they pretty much can do whatever they want. They have almost no accountability at CFPB. And they have no limits on their funding. So they can cut themselves an almost unlimited amount of money by saying, please transfer us this much from the Federal Reserve. So they could sort of create whatever they wanted to as a regulatory agency, but then you would be dependent upon a government agency perfecting your own private right. So those are the three basic things that are on the table. And that's kind of the discussion amongst my colleagues. What is the best framework, or is it some combination of them?
Right. Thank you for sharing that. I think the average individual, feels very powerless against a lot of these sort of, even when you get to click that or slide that bar, is it really working? Is it, and the follow cookies thing, companies got creative. You can't even tell, like, am I actually not being followed, or are the cookies on or off? It's really interesting.
100%. And you get these giant, like 400-page terms of service and 6-point fonts. And it's like, I just click accept. I mean, and that's why it's important, in my view, that there have to be things that are just out of bounds. I don't even care, no matter how bad you want to put it in your terms of service. Some things have to be off limits.
Yeah, I really would love to meet the person who actually reads every TNC. Not happening. We just want to get to that application.
Right.
Thank you very much for sharing that. You have that's a big problem to solve, and we could easily go another hour just talking about what big tech does and their TNCs and whatnot. Thank you, Carl, for asking that question. We have a few questions here related to Wyoming, and I don't know how much you're actually following all the Wyoming stuff, but it is a state. We work very closely with Wyoming, just as a point of disclosure. We think they're being very innovative. Obviously, they've passed a number of bills. There's a question here from Matt asking about your thoughts on whether the Wyoming Decentralized Autonomous Organization DAO bill will make any impact on Congress or SEC, or if you think it's just too far.
Well, I think, look, broadly, Wyoming is doing great things in this space. They're clearly the leader as a state in terms of providing regulatory clarity. Texas recently adopted a custody standard so that you can bank crypto in Texas. It'd be great, in my opinion, if the Ohio legislature would largely copy Wyoming. And this is one of the debates. Some of the Wyoming people in particular don't like that there would be a federal preemption standard. Right. So even some of the things that I think people that follow it closely, Brian Brooks, when he was at the Office of the Comptroller of Currency, he started moving out and pushing for some good regulatory standards for bank regulators. But some of the folks in Wyoming weren't gung-ho about that because it gave everyone in the country a chance to have a level up with what they've been doing in their state.
Right.
But I think broadly, preemption is good for the United States because, we are one market. And so the idea that you have to selectively apply these standards, how do you do it? Do you say you're a Wyoming resident, but you're visiting California, but the transaction's actually occurring for a company that's websites hosted in Delaware? It's like, it's just nice to have a uniform market in that sense. So I broadly favor preemption and wish that some of my colleagues in the House would replicate a lot of the things that they've done well in Wyoming.
Right. No, I absolutely agree that there's a certain level of benefit of federal level continuity and allowances, because if it goes state by state, we're talking about it gets very complicated very quickly for the entrepreneur.
Yeah, and if you just look at what actually happens is, like, privacy laws, for example, in the absence of doing anything in Congress, California's law is essentially becoming America's default, right? And so you wind up with if we didn't do anything comprehensive, it'd be a shame if bit license became the default for America, right? It'd be great if we made Wyoming's laws be the default for America, but inherently bit license is going to come into conflict with Wyoming's laws. So why not create the regulatory clarity that's needed? And hopefully we get it, in my view, skewed heavily towards where Wyoming's at. But you got to recognize I have to drag some folks that think somehow bit license was a good idea.
Yes, I will say the new team over at New York State DFS is trying very hard to put on a much more innovative and faster pace process, but they still have to deal with the legacy bit license. There's, not much to do with that other than try to make it a better system. You've got a question here. We're going to pivot just slightly, but it is a question around your thoughts on whether you're concerned at all about tech companies, especially the big ones, playing a role in developing digital identity. Apple came out with a big announcement, like I think last week, was it? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I'm concerned. I mean, there's a reason I like blockchain so well, is it creates a permissionless system. And right now in the US, big tech is essentially established itself as the judge, jury, and executioner. And you want to say, well, but they're a private company, they're not the government. But when you look at this third party doctrine, they're essentially acting often they're acting as agents of the government. Just staying on Apple recently, because they had the data, the government forced them to hand over data on lawmakers, trying to find out who's leaking classified information. Now, that could be a legitimate question, but if it's targeted, then it's, you've got a warrant and it's specific. That's the Fourth Amendment. But if it's just a giant data sweep to say, I don't know, give us everything you know about whatever topic, that's possible because of third party doctrine. So, individual companies are essentially deputized and they're allowed to operate their business to the extent that they're supportive of the government. In America, that's much more polite than, say, a regime like China, but it's still a reality. So I think the better thing is to get a good architecture where some of the data isn't collected in the first place. And in the absence of that, I think one of the most meaningful things that the federal government could do is radically change this third party doctrine and the way it's been abused, especially with respect to privacy.
Thank you for highlighting that. I think a lot of folks here would very much agree with you or be aligned with that line of thinking. Believe it or not, we've blown through 45 minutes. So I'm going to give you the last word on your thoughts on any advice you have for entrepreneurs sitting there who already started a company or about to start a company in the US, and also what we can do to help you. So.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Look, it's an honor to be invited to join you all. And for all the entrepreneurs out there, I had a startup that worked, and it's tough work. It is very all consuming. The fundamentals is you got to know your burn rate on cash, and you got to generate some. You can't do it like the federal government and just create it.
Right.
That'll get you in a lot of trouble.
Right.
But I'm hopeful that you'll do your innovation in the United States, and we'll get the environment that'll let you flourish and have all the opportunity that you can achieve with your talent and good ideas. And the other thing is, it is all about people. So hopefully you'll find the right people that'll help you along the way, both in the organization and out of it. And hopefully your people that represent you here in Congress can move along. So toward that, if you can find the time, especially in startup world, it's hard, reach out to your members of Congress and invite them to things, help them understand what you're dealing with. And if you can't get the member on your calendar, get their staffs on your calendar so that they come out and experience it. Because when things wind up on my calendar, I get a pretty detailed briefing from my staff, and it does help move the debate. So best of luck with all your innovation. Please stay in touch, and thanks for the chance to join y'all.
Thank you, and excellent advice. If you can't reach out to the member, then make sure you reach out to the staffers because they also know a ton and are very critical to the whole process. So thank you again for joining us. We appreciate it. I'm going to hand back over to Sophia, and I will apologize. We got a lot of questions, and so a number of them did not get answered. Apologies that we ran out of time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Congressman, for joining us. We so appreciate you taking the time to share your insights with our community. And to everyone who dialed in, a recording of this webinar will be shared and distributed with you all. You can check GBBC's website or YouTube page. I'd also like to remind you that this is a weekly series, so you can join us next week, June 22nd at 10 a.m. Eastern Time for a conversation with Professor Chris Brummer of the Institute of International and Economic Law at Georgetown University's Law Center. Thanks again, Congressman, and thank you, Sandra. I hope you all have a great rest of your day.